Imagine your government just entirely collapses overnight.
Right.
Like the economy completely evaporates, the police lose control, and your guaranteed factory job, it just vanishes.
Just gone in an instant.
Exactly. And suddenly the streets outside your apartment are ruled by whoever is, the strongest, the fastest, and the most intimidating.
It's a terrifying thought.
It really is. So what do you wear to survive the walk home in a world like that? Well, for millions of young men in the 1990s, the answer was a simple three-stripe tracksuit.
Yeah, I mean, we usually think of our wardrobes as these highly individualized, consequence-free zones, right?
Right? Like you pick a shirt just because of your mood or, I don't know, the weather.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But occasionally, a piece of clothing transcends just personal style.
Yeah.
It becomes this living, breathing, historical document of societal trauma, economic collapse, and just massive cultural transformation.
And that is exactly what we're unpacking today on this deep dive. We're looking at an incredible document called The Uniform of Collapse, Adidas and Post-Soviet Youth.
It's such a fascinating source.
Oh, totally. Our mission today is to track the unbelievable journey of this German sportswear brand Adidas and explore how it morphed from just, a piece of athletic gear into the ultimate symbol of economic collapse.
And then how it became literal physical armor for street survival.
Yes. Before taking one final, highly ironic turn onto the luxury runways of Paris and Milan, and we're going to dive into the raw reality of this era, purely examining what the source outlines regarding the ideologies at play, from Soviet collectivism to Western capitalism.
Right, just to understand how those ideologies violently collided on the streets.
Exactly. So for anyone listening who has ever seen those, squatting Slavic tracksuit internet memes.
Oh, we've all seen them.
Right. If you've ever wondered where that aesthetic actually comes from, get ready for a serious aha moment.
Absolutely. Because to understand how a tracksuit becomes armor, you really have to realize what preceded it.
Right. Set the scene for us.
So for decades, the visual landscape of the Soviet era was entirely state-mandated. The source details how the aesthetics heavily glorified collectivism.
Meaning clothing was intentionally functional, muted, and, meant to be uniform across the board.
Exactly. It was all about maintaining the continuity of the system. Excessive self-expression or, highly personal style wasn't just frowned upon.
It was viewed with deep suspicion, wasn't it?
Oh, deeply. If you stood out, you were signaling that you thought of yourself as separate from the collective whole.
Like you were placing the individual above the state.
Right. It was considered ideologically unnecessary and, frankly, even dangerous by the state.
But, that collectivist mindset created a massive blind spot when Western brands finally began leaking through the Iron Curtain.
It really did. In the final years of the Soviet Union, Western products weren't just consumer goods.
No, they were like tangible proof that a completely different reality existed out there. Western brands represented individuality, freedom of movement, and capitalist desire.
What's fascinating here is the psychological weight of this.
Yeah, let's unpack this for a second. Because in a sea of state-mandated gray and brown, wearing 3 bright white stripes down your leg,
It was a shock to the system.
it was like finding a vibrant neon glitch in a black and white movie. It fundamentally disrupted the visual order, and it was a disruption you could physically wear.
Totally, because for young people in the Soviet Union at that time, the West was largely an abstract concept. I mean, it only existed through incredibly grainy, pirated VHS tapes.
Or like smuggled underground magazines and rumors of music videos.
Exactly. Capitalism was this massive, invisible economic system that they couldn't actually participate in.
But a logo is tangible. You can touch a brand, you can wear it, you can boldly carry it right through a public square.
Yeah, the Adidas logo wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a small fragment of the West leaking directly into everyday life.
But how did it actually get there? Like, the true catalyst for this cultural infiltration was the 1980 Moscow Olympics, right?
That was the turning point.
Yeah.
The Soviet leadership found themselves in this unique dilemma. They needed to absolutely dominate the medal table to prove the superiority of their system on the global stage.
Yeah.
But they also recognized that their domestic athletic gear just wasn't up to the performance standards of Western brands.
So they strike this sort of devil's bargain. They allow Adidas to outfit the Soviet team.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It's crazy. And they try to sanitize it, right? They strip the actual word Adidas off the uniforms.
Right, but they left the 3 stripes. They genuinely thought they could control the narrative. But everyone watching knew exactly what those stripes meant.
It was a visual Trojan horse.
A perfect way to put it.
Yay.
It entered the system through state-sanctioned sports culture, But it didn't stay on the track for very long.
Not at all. Almost immediately, the tracksuit migrated into street culture.
It transformed into an object associated with modernity itself. The silhouette looked dynamic, mobile, and above all, unrestricted.
Unrestricted, that's the key word. It signaled that the wearer was connected to something larger, something beyond the borders of the state.
So we have this really fascinating setup in the 1980s. Adidas is this rare, highly coveted symbol of the West, a little slice of capitalist freedom inside a tightly controlled state.
But then the 1990s arrive,
Yeah.
and the Soviet Union doesn't just, experience a recession. According to the source, the entire state apparatus literally evaporates.
It was a total structural and mental collapse.
Yeah.
The state and the economy fell apart simultaneously.
The safety nets, the predictability, the guaranteed pensions, just gone in the blink of an eye.
Hyperinflation wiped out savings literally overnight. Unemployment soared into the stratosphere, and organized crime immediately stepped into the vacuum left by the police.
It's just overnight, the rules of reality vanished. Think about what this did to personal identity.
It's staggering. Before the collapse, you found your power and your identity through your role in the state machine.
Right, you were a respected factory manager or a decorated soldier or a loyal bureaucrat. You commanded respect because the state backed you up.
Suddenly, those roles mean absolutely nothing. The factory shuttered, the military isn't getting paid, the state is broke.
You can no longer express who you are or claim any authority through your job title.
No. People were forced into a terrifying new paradigm where they had to define themselves strictly through what they owned.
And more importantly, how they looked. Because in a chaotic, lieless environment, your appearance becomes your primary currency.
It's the only thing you have left to signal your status and protect yourself.
Exactly. I mean, the traditional tailored suit, which used to be the ultimate symbol of authority, now it just evoked the old, failed bureaucracy.
Right. Nobody trying to survive the streets of the 1990s wanted to look like the architects of this system that had just ruined their lives.
But the Adidas tracksuit, it carried the aggressive, unfiltered energy of the new era. It was fast. It was harsh.
And it was highly visible. It became this incredibly flexible identity system because it could represent several things at once.
Like the aspirational West, new money, physical freedom, and raw street power.
Exactly. Whether you were an Olympic weightlifter, a black market hustler, or a newly wealthy oligarch, the tracksuit worked for you.
Wait, hold on though. Let's push back on this a little and clarify something from the source. This wasn't just about trying to look cool or athletic, right? You're saying this was literal streetwear functioning as a defense mechanism.
That is exactly what the source outlines. For young men in working-class peripheral neighborhoods, the public spaces became intensely hostile.
Because economic instability and weak state authority meant everyday life was just saturated with the threat of violence.
Exactly. When the police can no longer protect you, the way you present yourself physically determines whether you become a target.
Wow. So masculinity and power had to be actively constructed on the pavement.
Yes. And this is the exact environment that gives birth to the Gopnik aesthetic.
Right. And for anyone listening who has seen the memes, the young guys in tracksuits, flat caps, squatting on their heels, smoking cigarettes, that is a Gopnik.
And the term itself is often traced back to the Russian slang Gopstop, which means a street mugging.
Which tells you everything you need to know. It was not an ironic fashion trend.
Not at all. The Gopnik aesthetic was an entirely utilitarian response to poverty and danger. The concept of comfort was essentially weaponized.
Because tight synthetic tracksuits made movement easier, meaning you had physical speed. You could run from the police, or you could fight a rival.
Exactly. Even the posture, the famous Slavic squat, was born of necessity.
Yeah, explain that, because I think people just see it as a funny pose.
Right. But imagine you are hanging out outside bleak, brutalist, concrete apartment blocks in freezing temperatures.
Okay.
You don't want to sit on the freezing, dirty ground, but you have literally nowhere else to go.
Right.
So you squat. Combine that with exaggerated aggressive masculinity and hard facial expressions, and you have a deliberate strategy for avoiding vulnerability.
The line between aesthetics and intimidation just completely vanished. You wore the tracksuit to avoid disappearing inside a brutal new system.
You wore it to broadcast that you were tough enough and connected enough not to be messed with.
And we also have to factor in the mafia connection, which really cemented the danger associated with this clothing.
Oh, absolutely. Throughout the 1990s, the visual language of the Russian criminal underworld was heavily built around sportswear.
Right. The source mentions that while the top-level bosses might have eventually graduated to red blazers or Italian suits,
The foot soldiers, the enforcers, the guys doing the actual extortion on the streets, they were exclusively in tracksuits.
it became deeply intertwined with the shadow economy.
So much so that seeing someone in a full tracksuit walking toward you on the street was a visceral signal of potential danger.
It meant this person operated outside the broken laws of the collapsed state. The clothing itself commanded a fearful respect. But
Oh,
here's where I get stuck. I'm struggling to understand the economics of this.
yeah, it's a huge paradox.
Right. You have a collapsed state, hyperinflation, and massive unemployment. There is zero chance that millions of unemployed youth hanging out in the courtyards of decaying industrial cities were buying imported, authentic, high-end German sportswear.
No, the math simply does not work.
The math does not work.
And it doesn't work because it's a massive illusion. This brings us to one of the most profound psychological elements of this era that the source highlights.
Okay, lay it on us.
This entire culture, this incredibly powerful aesthetic of intimidation and survival, was not built around authentic products. The post-Soviet economy was absolutely flooded with counterfeit goods.
Oh, wow. Open-air markets, known as rinky, just popped up everywhere.
Everywhere, packed with cheap tarps and folding tables. They were overflowing with fake Adidas tracksuits, pirated Nike sneakers, imitation luxury products shipped in from Turkey or China.
You'd see jackets with 4 stripes instead of 3, or logos misspelled as, like, Ababes.
Exactly. Those counterfeit goods were the true face of the new economic system.
So capitalism arrived, for the vast majority of people, not in its original pure form, but through this cheap, chaotic imitation.
It's a tragic, fascinating dynamic. People could clearly see the life that capitalism promised. The wealth, the color, the freedom.
But they couldn't actually reach it.
Right. They wanted to buy into the West so desperately, but their economic reality only granted them access to a simulation of it.
Which created this constant state of incomplete desire. I mean, here's where it gets really interesting to me. When you think about it, wearing that counterfeit tracksuit is like wearing a backstage pass to a concert you aren't actually allowed to attend.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it. These youths were projecting an image of a world that they had approached, but were firmly locked out of.
Because in that survival environment, the authenticity of the tag inside the collar didn't matter.
No, the visibility of the logo was the only thing that mattered. The logo was the new language of power.
Right. If you wore the stripes, even if they were literally peeling off, you appeared integrated into the new order. You just needed to get as close as possible to the symbols of power to survive the street.
It really exposes how the counterfeit economy wasn't purely a financial phenomenon. It was a deeply psychological coping mechanism.
People had lost their class positions, their guaranteed futures, their safety.
And they were attempting to construct brand new identities out of the rubble. And they were doing it through the only avenue left to them, consumption.
But because the goods were fake, that consumption remained fragile. It wasn't real luxury. It was the performance of luxury.
It wasn't real power. It was the projection of power. They were wearing the uniform of a club that wouldn't let them in the door, just to survive the violence of the alleyway outside.
Which lays bare one of capitalism's most raw, uncomfortable truths that the source discusses. People will desperately try to carry the image of belonging to a system, even when they are entirely excluded from its benefits.
The psychological armor was woven from pure aspiration and desperation.
Which makes the final chapter of this cultural journey so incredibly ironic.
The high fashion twist.
Yes, because we've established that this aesthetic was born of genuine economic trauma, the threat of street violence, and counterfeit survival. But for decades, the Western world looked at this exact imagery. The tracksuits, the concrete blocks, the shaved heads.
And viewed it as completely crude. It was treated as a stereotype of the uncivilized or dangerous East.
It was everything high fashion wanted to separate itself from.
Exactly. And as the internet grew, it was sanitized into humorous, viral memes. The danger was stripped away, leaving only a caricature.
But fast forward to the 2010s, the luxury fashion world, Paris, Milan, the ultimate billion-dollar gatekeepers of high-end capitalism.
And they start paying really close attention.
Why this sudden shift?
Well, luxury fashion was experiencing a profound exhaustion with its own pristine aesthetics. For years, good taste was defined by absolute silence, restraint, and control.
Ah, the era of minimalism, neutral tones, cashmere sweaters, and invisible wealth.
Right, what we call quiet luxury. looking perfectly curated, perfectly safe, and utterly untouchable.
But eventually, that perfectly curated safety just becomes predictable. It becomes boring.
The fashion industry is a machine, you know. It constantly needs new raw resources to mine for visual inspiration. When luxury gets bored of looking rich, it starts turning toward aesthetics that appear dirtier, harsher, and more real.
They wanted the edge, they wanted the danger, but, like, without any of the actual risks.
Exactly. And suddenly, post-Soviet youth became the biggest visual resource for high fashion. Brands like Vetments and Balenciaga, under the creative direction of designers like Demna Gvasalia, started drawing heavily from this exact Eastern European street style.
So you start seeing models walking down the center of pristine luxury runways, wearing oversized tracksuits, harsh, aggressive silhouettes, and chunky sneakers.
The literal atmosphere of economic collapse was being showcased as avant-garde art.
I mean, the designer Gosha Rubchinsky really capitalized on this, right? He brought this post-Soviet youth reality straight into the high fashion mainstream.
You did. His campaigns weren't shot in glamorous studios. They were filled with pale skater boys, gray, decaying apartment blocks, exhausted faces, and of course prominently featured Adidas tracksuits.
It was a total shock to the system for the Western fashion elite.
Because it felt so raw, so untheorized compared to the overly intellectualized minimalist looks they were used to. It felt incredibly powerful. It felt authentic.
Okay, but I have to ask a serious question here. What are we actually looking at? When you take a $10 counterfeit survival aesthetic born from the collapse of a superpower and you slap a $1,500 price tag on it for a celebrity to wear in Los Angeles,
Right.
are these luxury brands honoring this history, or is high fashion essentially just cosplaying working class poverty?
That is the crucial question. And it points directly to an inescapable cynical irony. The fashion industry repeatedly turns aesthetics it once looked down upon into something deeply cool.
But only once enough cultural distance has passed.
Exactly. Things that symbolize severe, grinding poverty eventually become high-end editorial aesthetics for the ultra-rich,
They repackage the trauma. They call it Slavic core or Eastern European chic.
which reveals fashion's oldest and perhaps most uncomfortable habit: consuming the aesthetics of poverty rather than addressing the poverty itself. It essentially gentrifies the struggle.
Consuming the aesthetics of poverty. Think about the stark contrast there. The young men who actually lived through the 1990s weren't making a style manifesto.
No, they weren't trying to challenge the boundaries of avant-garde fashion.
They wore those tracksuits so they wouldn't get mugged or killed on the way to the grocery store.
And turning the visual reality of that immense economic trauma into a luxury trend completely strips it of its original danger. It sanitizes the history while selling the thrilling illusion of that danger to people who have never had to face a day of true economic instability in their lives.
It is the ultimate dizzying twist of capitalism. I mean, the fake Adidas tracksuits of the 90s were a cheap, desperate imitation of Western luxury.
And today, Western luxury is making massively expensive imitations of those fake Adidas tracksuits.
It is a complete closed circle of simulation.
The tracksuit truly is a historical document. It began as a beacon of aspirational power, mutated into the literal armor of the displaced, and finally devolved into a sanitized costume for the elite.
It's an incredible journey. We've watched a simple logo start as a rare, vibrant glitch in a heavily controlled, collectivist state. We saw it transform into a counterfeit shield for a generation navigating the lawless collapse of their entire world.
And finally, we saw it get scooped up, sterilized, and sold on a runway.
It really makes you want to take a very close look at your own wardrobe. You know, what economic realities, what invisible histories of conflict or past traumas are just hanging there in your closet under the innocent guise of personal style.
It absolutely forces you to look at the clothing around you differently. And I think it leaves us with a rather provocative thought to consider about our own current moment.
Oh, what's that?
Well, if luxury fashion inevitably mines past economic anxieties, turning the survival tactics of the struggling class into authentic high-end trends once 20 or 30 years have passed,
Yeah.
what deeply stressful, unfiltered reality of today's culture will eventually be repackaged, sanitized, and sold back to us on a runway 20 years from now?
Man, that is a genuinely haunting question. Will the visual markers of today's gig economy or the coping mechanisms of our current crises be tomorrow's couture?
It's very possible.
Well, next time you see a piece of clothing, remember, it might just be a historical document waiting to be read. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll catch you next time.